Okay, welcome back, or welcome to the Hip Factor podcast. I am your host for today, Jay, and I'm joined by a guest, which I don't think anybody really knows who this person is. I mean, like Mason Lane. I don't know. Actually, that's obviously joking. Everyone knows who you are. I don't like all of these podcasts. I'm not going to do like an introduction because uh, there are other podcasts. So if you don't know who Mason Lane is, then you can just search his name on Google and then you'll find another podcast where he does like an actual intro.
Yeah, you guys talk about training on this show, right? So I mean,
We
if
just
you listen to this, you've heard me on something else.
exactly. So um I mean, I guess I'll do a brief intro. Like you've won limited nationals a couple times. You just finished second at production nationals this year.
Yep. Yep.
Um and yeah, you've won a bunch of stuff. You've been doing this for quite a long time. You started when you were pretty young, and I think we'll just jump into it. So, because the first question, and I find this interesting to hear people talk about, is the best stage that you have shot at a match that you can remember, and so like take us there really quick. Where's the match? When is it?
You're talking about the specific instance I probably said online more recently, right?
I didn't even have that in mind necessarily. I'm just thinking like overall for you.
Well, I'll go with that example because that's the one that I can remember offhand. So
Perfect.
that then I guess that was the question at USA Extreme Open, which was this year in early February or something like that. I shot a really, really good match. I shot a lot of stages that were tons of stages that were good, several stages that were near perfect, and one of them was one of the bigger stages in the match. The whole match was pretty low difficulty, but in a kind of positional in the sense that there wasn't a ton of positions and not a ton of opportunities to shoot things moving. And I had one stage where it was basically four positions, and you could blend it if you were confident and just sort of let it fly a little bit on a lot of like 15-yard low risk open targets, and just everything came together absolutely perfectly where I was able to hit it with like 3.5 positions, and every transition came together perfect. Every entry and everything was perfect. Uh, all the steel hits and everything were like that, were absolutely dialed. And so it was just everything came together perfectly. That would be an example of one that like I felt was, if I was going to put together a Mount Rushmore of stage performances, right, that one's probably on there.
Okay. And is there anything that you remember before that stage? So like what I guess what I'm asking first, and then I want to, then you can take that. But where in the match is this? Is it early in the day? Is it late in the day? Is it the third day? Where is it?
Yeah, that particular instance was that stage was like the clincher for the match for the most part. And I didn't have live scoring. I knew that I had like a 10-point lead coming in. It was a 30-stage match with 10 stages a day. And so I knew I had like a 10-point lead over the guy that I thought was my next closest competitor. But 10 points is really only a lead like when the match is over. That's not even really a lead with one stage left. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
functionally tied. And that stage, I had just shot two other bigger stages. So that was the last big stage in the match where there was a real opportunity for a major swing. And the ones prior went good, not great. And then that last stage was like, all right, do or die. Like you can clinch this up pretty much if you just shoot this stage really well. Because I'd shot not left tons of meat on the bone of much else that day. So I knew unless you're putting the ball back in the other dude's court, right? Like if you shoot a really exceptional day, then you can win. But I've shot really well, so
Yes.
I've done my part.
Okay. So now to that question, right before that stage, what is there anything that you remember that you were thinking about, essentially?
Yeah, I think I was squatted with some of my friends who were all dear friends and mostly very very high level competitors as well, and conventionally production shooters also. And a lot of those guys are a little bit more risk averse than I am, and so they're sitting there really aiming hard, really stopping for each position, like trying to like looking like they're trying hard to collect points, right, on a stage that was a full size 32 round stage with no shots past 15 yards and stuff like that. And sort of my mantra or my strategic approach that I wanted to implement for most of the match was to not try so hard to fight for points where it's not necessarily beneficial.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to take aggressive strategies that I knew I could net. Like if it's, say for example, I get a target that's 12 to 17 or yards or so, that sort of intermediate distance for iron sights. Maybe that's a little longer for optics. I did not want to sit there and fight for points where I thought I could potentially aim and still not get points. So really staying on the gas through the slower paced, low risk sections of the stage.
Okay.
If that,
And so that you're what I'm hearing is you want to shoot good on this stage and you are thinking about how to shoot good on this stage. And by shoot good, you're putting together something that's going to work, as in, like, you're going to shoot at some things on the move so that you connect positions together so that you have a fast time. Okay. And that's going to lead into the next thing, which is, and you've mentioned it. You mentioned it a couple posts. And I'm going to say it like managing risk, but
yeah,
you've said it in a lot of different ways, and you've said, like, examples of picking a partial target where you're like, okay, that target is a target that I like. There's all other open targets. There's a target that has it's partialed up. I can shoot Charlies on that.
yes,
For some like avoid. You're essentially taking risk away on that target, but trade. I don't know. I Tell us about that kind of idea.
yeah. Yeah, so there's tons of ways this goes, right? So the basic concept being risk management, like how do I control nuances of the stage approach in a way that minimizes risk and maximizes your time to whatever extent possible. And I mean, you can't talk about this without first talking about the caveat that it all comes down to the level of your training. Obviously, like, guys, if you and I show up to nationals and we're probably shooting on the same squad, the options that are at our fingertips are very different than someone that's shooting for a couple of years and is on a different squad and a different relay and is not as good at shooting yet, right? Like, it comes down to basic training. It comes down to knowing who you are as a shooter and what you can do, and it comes down to the math that's at play. So there's a lot of different ways to take the conversation. Probably the first most interesting to me is the subject of the math.
Yeah.
Um, I say always, try very hard to make a habit of anytime I show up to a match when I'm doping out the stages ahead of time, I'm going to estimate the hit factor down to within a whole number. And you can do that just by kind of like looking at basically, obviously, it's points divided by time. So it's a simple math equation for the most part. I'll usually start just assuming I'm going to shoot all A's. Like if I take a very even, normal, steady, careful approach, what would happen if I shoot maximum raw points and then I divide that time? Where do I get? And then I look at more realistically, okay, based on the actual difficulty of the target and some of the movement options I have, what points am I liable to drop? And then I can get a more precise number from there.
Has
But with that information, right, you can do a lot.
So I'm going to interrupt you there for a second. Has that process become pretty for you, and just answering for yourself? Has that process become pretty quick where you look at a stage, maybe you not even need to go on it, and you're like, all right, I'm gonna run this in maybe like 12, 13 seconds, and and then here's the hit factor. It's gonna be like a 7 or whatever. What's that been like? I mean, like, the
Yeah,
more you do it.
it's become more intuitive, and it's now to a point where I can probably estimate to within two whole numbers at least, just by looking at a like basic fraction of number of positions, number of rounds. You
Okay.
know what I mean? And
Does
that's for the bigger stages. Yeah, I have to still do the math in a little bit more of a careful manner just to make sure I'm not like missing any key details.
Do you find that the higher the hit factor goes, the more, like, volatile that uh your guess will be? Like, because if it's a really high hit factor, sometimes will you push yourself beyond that or land in a different way just because of how the time works?
In terms of the actual approach based on the number I derive,
Well, I mean, like, on if you think of a number and you're like, okay, this is going to be like an 11 factor stage, and then you run it, and you find more time in places, and you run it at like a 12.5. Like,
yeah,
is that range, does that change the higher the hit factor goes?
I'm
Or
not sure. I haven't really thought about it in those terms.
okay, it's not
I
really
mean,
relevant.
probably.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, obviously, the whole discussion is only relevant, like we said, to it's gated to the degree of control you have. Like this whole conversation is
Yeah.
pretty much irrelevant for anyone under masterclass, if we're completely honest, because
Yes.
the level of control to just avoid big picture mistakes is not there under that threshold.
Yeah.
But
All
yeah,
right. So anyway, to get back on track, you're finding out what you think the hit factor is going to be for you. And that's
Yeah,
important that it's for you. Um,
right.
and so then what do you do with that information?
From there, the number one chunk of wisdom I'll look at is what is the value of dropped points on target, right? So I know, just to cut to the chase, right? At a 5 factor, every Charlie costs you in terms of raw time 0.4 seconds, and at a 10 factor, it's half of that. And with that information, you can sort of gut check like your approach or your strategy for stage sections, or for, like you mentioned, like for partial strategy. So say for example, you get like a half cover, like, vertically split partial where you have the top half of the target, where there's a no shoot or something like that. Like, you can know to aim safe and just eat Charlies on a tough target like that. If you basically, the what it'll take you to aim and get the alphas is not worth what it could take you to what you would be rewarded with the raw points. If you actually like start to look at that math and be like, okay, if it's two Charlies, it's going to cost me 0.18 each, and it's only a half, 0.4 seconds of investment, but it's going to take me longer than that to get the A's.
Mhm.
I can eat crappy points and save risk and time. Those are the sorts of decisions you can make. You can also look at your movement options with a little bit more clear cut information. Like, if you just assume like it's imperative for me to get alphas no matter what, but it's an 8 or 9 factor stage, you could look down a lot of shooting on the move or soft entry opportunities that are very advantageous, especially when you start to look at, if you train that kind of stuff a lot, it can become a huge asset. And that's sort of the implementing the new risk strategy, like we're talking about a little bit
Yes.
for me this year. That's a lot of what I've been doing more of, is looking at, hey, in a training environment, what ratio of alphas can I get on this specific movement style or on this specific entry or with this very aggressive shooting pace? And if that number is over 50 or 75 or whatever the number percent is, I know at such and such a threshold I can make this work out more of the time than not, even assuming that I'm going to make mistakes.
Okay. So then this gets into, at least for me, this becomes the most interesting thing, is making that decision when you are at a match that you care about. So I'm talking about the decision of like, okay, I trained this thing. There's a couple 20-yard
Mhm.
targets. I'm going to take them pretty aggressively on the move because I've determined that strategy is good.
Right.
And then you're like, well, yeah, but that's kind of risky. Like, what, am I sure I'm going to do that? Like, other people in the squad are not even talking about that. They're going to stop here. Like, is that going to, so if, when that talk of like, are you sure you're going to do this comes in, then what do, what do you do to kind of stick to your plan? And yeah, that's it.
I would say, like, the gut feeling you have over, like, if you're not sure if it's a good idea or not, like, you have to really listen to that voice. And the confidence you're going to have in making a decision that stands out from the crowd is going to come from what you know you can do in training.
Yeah.
So the best thing I could give you is an example that illustrates that picture. Like, I've been training since about November or so. I've been reinvesting back into trying out shooting, like I've mentioned, on the low risk targets at distance. Basically, assuming I'm going to shoot 50% alphas on those, and then just doing that as fast as I possibly can. And behind the magician's cloak, basically, right? I'll probably miss on those like 5% of the time when I'm really just laying it out, and I'll probably shoot two alphas on them 60% of the time, and then like I'd single Charlie it or double Charlie it with whatever's left, like 30% of the time.
Yeah.
So if you look at that threshold, you know that about halfway up that spectrum we mentioned, from 5 to 10 factor, at roughly 7.5 or so, like we're hovering around that threshold. That strategy is the operant strategy, as long as you know you can consistently avoid missing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that really becomes the hard part, is how clear is the information going to be in the moment? If my fundamentals are not absolutely dialed in the moment when I go execute on that risky section, what's going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. So it comes down to, I would say, three big picture items, like, how do I feel day of? How is my match going? How am I shooting? Uh, do I have the ability to check to make sure the fundamentals at play are perfect at some point prior to that moment? Like, if I'm going to draw and shoot 3 20-yard targets on the move, right? I'm going to be less liable to take that option than if I'm able to shoot a little bit of stuff and then try it, because I
Mm,
know the latter example, I will know if the shooting is going well or not, and I can even make adjustments before I get to that section, right? And the last thing would be, hey, like, is this actually a practically advantageous thing to do?
Yeah. So like let's say this is the thing to do on the stage. I'm going to shoot these two targets or whatever on the move. They're further away. Worse, so like best case scenario, and this is something that Jacob had talked about when I talked to him. Best case scenario, it works out great. You shave a second and a half off of somebody that you're trying to shave us, like gain points on.
Yep.
Worst case scenario, you have to take a couple of makeup shots and maybe
Yep.
negate that time,
Hmm.
or maybe not entirely, and then you end up equal or just a little bit better. And so I think
Right.
I mean, that to me is something that I did not realize until a couple of years ago, where it was like,
Yeah.
oh no, I took a makeup shot. This is really bad.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, that's
Yeah.
not the
No,
case.
I've definitely fallen into the same trap. I know, like, probably it occurred to me in, I think, 2022, that I was trying too hard to be a perfectionist and just avoid mistakes and shoot basically a defensive a strategy match where if I just avoid mistakes, then maybe I can like waltz into a win. In the big matches that I've won, it's happened that way. I just had a durable faith that everyone else would make big mistakes, and I shot good, not great for me, and walked out on top. But you can't win if you're shooting against people that are actually at your level or even better than you. You can't win that way,
Yeah,
except for in statistical anomalies.
yeah. I mean,
So what you're describing, as far as like looking at best case, worst case scenario, like the X factor there to make that happen is, number one, like knowing where the holes are going in real time, like having the fundamental soundness to be able to call bad shots and fix it immediately. And the other thing is being able to like see mistakes happen and not let it bother you, right? And that's
mhm.
like, I definitely, the first two matches for me this year, that part started to come together because I just went in expecting small time mistakes like that, and then it's like, if you just don't look at that like it's an issue, you can just fix it on the fly, then you can, it takes some conditioning, but you can make it happen if you just go in with the right headspace.
Yeah. So I mentioned before we started recording, but you did a talk through on the Caribbean Open. Um,
Yeah.
and there's a couple stages that pop into my mind from that match that I did not shoot that match. That there was a position where you came in, shot some steel, and then threw a couple makeups on a piece of steel, and then got back on plan and then shot the rest of the stage. But
Hmm.
you were shooting early enough on the steel that it worked out. And that reminds me too of a match. It was up here in Maine a couple of years ago, and I remember seeing you post a video on it, and there was like some mini poppers that you took on the move going across the position. I don't even remember what match it was. It was the standby or the Area 7 or something like that. And I remember looking at that and being like, that hey, that's kind of sloppy. And then looking at my video and being like, yeah, but he beat me by 2 seconds on that stage. And that was one of those big things of like, oh, okay, like there are places where even if you take risk, it's not risk.
Right.
It looks wild behind the gun because you're like, oh, that didn't hit. That hit, didn't hit, that hit.
Yeah.
Um,
Sometimes it looks ludicrous even from a third person, but you realize, like exactly like Jake said, the best, even the worst case scenario is better than the best case scenario. I'm playing it safe.
yeah, yeah. So now into this piece of essentially you're talking about trying it out enough at matches to then and this specifically this is helping you try at least shooting at a pace and making specific decisions where you mess up enough that you're not going to let that bother you in the future.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's very interesting. And so this is not like a training thing where it's like or is it? Like in
Well,
training.
I think the specific like mathematical factoids you have, like those can help nudge you in a given direction in terms of your attitude or your behavior towards performing under pressure.
Yep.
But really, your ability to execute on that strategy is going to come down to how comfortable you are within the moment. So maybe like you do or don't feel pressure, that can push the needle in one direction or the other in terms of your ability to execute all the way to your potential. but also it just comes down to knowing what you can do. Like I think the training environment helps you understand what you can do in theory, but if you show up to a match and it doesn't, you're like you don't feel good about your shooting, you're not shooting well for you, it's not going to work out. Like the best thing you can do is still cruise control mode and play it safe.
Right.
But yeah, it's very important to identify opportunities where you're where you would conventionally think from a conservative shooter's approach, you would think, oh, that's a risky approach. You have to also understand that if five other dudes who you're trying to beat are going to take that option and it's going to work out for four of them, then you're wrong to not be trying it. As
Yeah.
long as the penalty, the risk of failing is not something that's going to take you out of the match.
Yeah, and especially at matches like that you've mentioned before, and at least the last few years at like CO Nationals where everyone's there, and
Mm-hmm.
and that you can't coast through, uh,
No, no.
yeah, like one 4 out of the 5 guys trying that thing are gonna get it, and then
Mm-hmm.
and if you don't try it, well then you automatically are one of the people who don't get it,
Absolutely.
uh, and And so I guess this switch that you've made, in the past, I mean, it hasn't been like it wasn't just this year that you made this necessarily.
No, it's
Um,
been small pieces have been contributing to it for years.
yeah, yeah. And I guess well, I don't know. There's a few different things with it, but I guess what I want to get at is what for you when you are on a stage and like you mentioned pressure and
Mm-hmm.
if you're feeling more of it which for me like that's always helped me to
Mm-hmm.
to pay more attention or be uh like pay more attention to the programming piece. And you mentioned with the Extreme Open where there was that stage that everything did come together. Did you have pressure on yourself in that moment that you were then trying to deal with and direct some?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I can relate to both experiences. I can relate to being the guy that gets pressurized and cracks and makes mistakes and overtries or tries too hard to be a perfectionist. And I can relate to having experiences where the pressure just helps you focus, like you're describing.
Okay.
And I can also relate to at matches like the Extreme, where you start shooting good, and the better you shoot, the more reckless you can get, and it gets to a point where just like there's almost no risk you're not willing to take because you're shooting very well for you.
Sure.
You know what I mean? So I can relate to every experience there. I can tell you like I've won and lost matches feeling like violently physically ill, like Porta John trips, like when you're on deck instead of walking the stage, kind of ill
Yep.
because you're so nervous because you feel like it'll change your life if you win. And I've had a lot more experiences where I have that a similar feeling and completely blow it out of my butt. Right. So
Yep.
it's hard to necessarily say like where how you vector in how you feel about it, but definitely making smart decisions and like building the match up in terms of your confidence and ability over the course of the match helps for me a lot. I don't
Where
know if that answers the question very very comprehensively, but
Where were you on that scale of feeling pressure at the extreme on that stage that you shot?
at that point in the match, I was very very little.
Very little.
Earlier in the day, like knowing that I was looking down the barrel of 10 stages that had to be like, I mean, putting it a little slightly more perspective, I shot 2 days against a guy that is functionally a world champion. If you take Eric out of the picture, right, and was able to hold him even, basically speaking, right. So I knew if I shot like shooting perfect or good, almost exclusively for me, I could hold this guy about even. So I'm like looking down, you got to shoot another 10 stages, good or perfect for you over again. So those first 4 or 5 stages, or whatever I had shot prior to that point that we're talking about, like yeah, I was feeling a ton of pressure at that point. Like these have to be at least good, if not great, or you will not win this match. Period. And once it starts to go better and better, it's like then it becomes like, all right, yeah, you can do this. It starts to be less of a pressure sensation, less of a performance anxiety sensation, and that's when like you're describing, it's more like the pressure feels less like pressure and anxiety and more like pressure focus.
Yeah, okay. That's what I'm wondering. And so in that specific case, I mean, obviously there are other ones where you don't feel great going into the stage and then you perform very well on
Mm-hmm.
it. And then there's the other way where you feel really good, it, and it doesn't connect the way that you wanted it to.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but Okay, that's interesting. Um,
I think like sort of springing off that too, like it kind of depends a little bit on the stuff that you just think you're good at in terms of what's going to make you feel some sort of way about it. And that's, I guess, to give an example of that, like conventionally for me, stages that have minimal positions or less required shooting on the move or less complicated procedures with lots of different positions and lots of different stuff, I tend to do better on those. Like when I can just get to a spot and lean on my shooting ability, because I shoot faster than realistically like most people in my peer group, but
yeah,
I'm not as effective at the dynamic shooting stuff, like staying low and shooting tons of wide transitions, moving and stuff like that. I feel so stages that have tons of dead sprints or many positions, like that's the stuff where usually I'll be like, hey, you need to remember to like run as hard as you can, but then not let all that tension come into your body. And then that ends up turning into all kinds of, hard to articulate thoughts and feelings that start to undermine the pressure that it starts feeling like pressure anxiety and not like pressure focus, if that
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah.
Or the
Uh,
pressure, you feel the pressure and it feels more like it's a compulsion to make everything perfect by either trying to be faster than you should try to, or like you were describing, by trying to be a perfectionist and avoid mistakes, which generally is a compounding error.
yeah, yeah. Both are not great. So you mentioned the. I'm just because it has happened to me recently, and I've induced it recently on myself. This idea of running really hard and then trying to let go of that
Mm-hmm.
tension and do a skill. And so I
Yep.
did like I have this swinger set up and I can stand still and shoot it nicely, clean timing, everything's good. And then I was like, all right, well, let me let me run into this position, address this mover sequence, and then run away.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's where the training then began. Uh,
Yeah.
and so talk about that a little bit in the sense of training, like what is that like, and what have you found to work through some of that? Like mentally and then physically when you're training it, like that idea of dropping tension when you need to.
Yeah. I think in terms of the hard skills at play, people don't necessarily appreciate that, like, what you can do static. Like, okay, I'm going to draw and do procedure X. Like, you have that basic impression of what the grip fundamentals and the vision fundamentals and the trigger fundamentals all are going to be like when you go to do the shooting, when you're standing and comfortable. But then when the gun is coming from an abstract place and you have to remember to build your grip right and you have to remember to look at the spot and like, oh yeah, now I've been running really hard, so I'm carrying all this tension in my neck and shoulders and back, and I have to remember to let all that melt away. Like that starts to complicate things a lot, and what you think you can do standing and comfortable becomes a little bit of a different picture when you're having to execute on all that stuff while applying yourself athletically. So I don't
Yeah.
think people necessarily just in general appreciate that difference. And the problem for most people is that they carry way too much tension when they're running, right? Like we say, maximum effort. You're going somewhere, you go with maximum effort. But you have to train yourself to do that in a manner that, like, when you're 3, 4, whatever steps out from the position, you remember, like, all right, time to let your neck melt, let your back melt, just get your hands on the gun and focus on what you're seeing, because that's what's going to matter.
Yep.
That people tend to not do that, right? Like they run with their entire body, they chug really hard. Maybe they like jam the gun in and out of the position when they're running. Like they do this giant arm motions, and they're still super tense when they show up. In classes, a lot of the time, like if I have someone that's trying wicked hard, like they look like they're all running with their shoulders, I'll make them put their gun on the ground and hook their hands, like put their hands deep in their pockets and run with no arms, and prove like, hey, like you're accomplishing the same speed spot to spot, like just focusing on running with your legs. So let's do that and just like let the gun do whatever it wants. And now you can focus on the shooting and not trying so hard to run. And
Yeah.
that works pretty well. In terms of the mental management aspect of it, it's hard.
Well,
I wouldn't say I mastered it because it's still a thing for me. I mean, that's like those sorts of stages for me are still always a factor. Like I have to remember, be confident in your plan. Just like don't worry about how long this feels like it's taking. When it's time to run, run. When it's time to shoot, shoot.
yeah, and I guess what I'm talking about with that is like the programming piece. If you have a I mean the example, it can happen with everything. It can happen at the end of a draw where you where
Yep.
you just keep tension. But like for the example of a medium distance run to some precise shooting, uh programming that like before you shoot it in as part of like the visualization or whatever, is that an
Yeah.
element there?
Yeah, definitely. Like I use specific grip cues usually. Usually when I'm focused, I have to focus on the marksmanship aspect, like you're describing. Like it's a precision shooting element. I'm gonna focus on the vision, then the grip, then the trigger in that order, whether I'm shooting it on an entry or if I'm shooting it static. And I'll usually focus look to source those cues in that order when I'm gonna do it on an entry, or if I'm focusing more on the movement than the actual shooting. So it's like, okay, you're running into the spot, you're looking at the ground. Now remember to look up and like zoom your eye in as hard as you can to try to see some target detail or to try to get your eye to go small. Okay, I'm doing that. I'm seeing a spot. I'm seeing the appropriate sight confirmation. Still maybe not getting the results I want in a training environment. Now we're going to go to the grip aspect, right? When I'm putting that first foot on the ground in the spot, I want to have like that hard pinch back, have the gun in front of your face, some specific grip cue, right?
Yeah.
And then kind of go down the list from there to the less and less likely suspects of causing the issue and figure out what the problem is.
Yeah.
And usually the failure point is that I underestimate how long it takes me to get a really perfect grip put together. So usually, especially in the early season, like if I haven't had a lot of chances to do running around training, I'll focus on like, hey, when you're 3 or 4 steps out, like get the back of your hand on the back of your other hand and pinch hard so that you get that 360 grip pressure with your support hand, and don't just drive into the one side of it and like tilt the gun over. Like that's my specific nitpick thing these days.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so it's an interesting, like these skills that you're talking about. I mean, those are huge separators for people. And when you have elements like that in a match, then people who are good at them separate themselves from the people who are really good at just standing still. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
even like a step draw into a position where you're shooting one target and then you have to leave, like, is a huge separator.
Oh yeah,
Just
yeah,
on like what people train and the way people think about it.
yeah.
Where if someone's like, "Well, I have a .7 draw standing, um, and I'm not running away after I do that draw." But like those skills are, I find
Like
that like,
it all comes down to like people will build fundamentals that support the drill they're doing and not the skill that they're trying to cultivate, right? A scoop draw is a good example. Like, yeah, I can bang out like a .6 scoop draw or whatever when I'm standing here, but like, when's the last time you did that on a stage? And the logical follow up question is, are you trying to learn two different ways to draw? Because I'm not, right? Or
yeah,
another example, like your stance, like you say, do two at 25, draw, bang, two alphas. That's not an easy drill, like to get to hit the par time, but it's very achievable, especially with a red dot. What does it look like if you do it on an about face on a turn and draw, or if you have to run 3 steps and then execute on that,
hmm
right? If the marksmanship fundamentals change based on context on any level, whether it's the difficulty or speed of the target, risk of the target, the movement context, like that's going to be a huge issue for you, right?
yeah,
And there's obviously movement skills associated with it that no matter what sort of movement you're doing, like there's some basic habits that translate well to being flexible.
yeah. So this is just a question for you. What are you working on in training right now? So like today, yesterday, what have you been working on? Obviously, this only applies to you. I'm talking to the listeners, which who knows? I don't know how many listeners there are, but anyway, I'm talking to them. This only applies to you. I'm curious in your answer for this. Like, what have you been doing?
Sure. I did in the very early season, prepping for the earlier matches. I did tons of just fundamentals. So do dry fire, trying to get it so you can do basically dry fire bill drills, hard and fast, and have everything go perfect. And then that translates well to being able to do precision shooting, where you can draw the gun out and hit any target without thinking about it that hard. And coming into this part of the year, where I have a little bit more opportunity to move around and do real training, like on a bunch of different targets. Now I'm starting to shoot more like arrays, trying to get the discipline up on steel, get those hit percentages up without over aiming, trying to try out a little bit of the strategy we talked about a little bit earlier, and try to just be generally more consistent when I'm shooting a bunch of different complicated stuff all together. As I go deeper into the season, I'm going to start to implement more and more of the real, like implementing movement techniques. Right now, to the extent I'm doing that, it's pretty much just remembering to build a stance habit that's going to set me up to do that effectively later on.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I'm going to shift way away from training for a second. This is not my question, but I really like it, and I'm going to ask it to you. It's from someone we both know, and we talked about him before. Um, are you going to win production world shoot this year?
I think so. I mean, here's the thing about world shoots: it takes a lot of luck to even be there.
Yeah, it does.
So a big piece of that luck has already fallen into my lap, right? I have plans laid to go. I have a slot. I have people that support me that make it so I can train as much as I want to.
Hmm.
I'm taking that a little bit more seriously this year, trying to get in shape and stuff like that. So, yeah, like I'm doing my part. Whether or not I win, I've proven that that I can. If I shoot just good for me, I can be roughly even with people that have won the match before.
Yeah.
So I don't know, probably.
Yeah. Okay. So do you that was that the answer that you would have given for last World Shoot? You've been to a
No.
few now. Yeah. Okay. No.
Well, there's one real big asterisk on that,
Yes,
right?
I know. Yeah. Yeah. I know. Um, now, even so, like, what is it? The one before that. So 2017. Would that been have been the answer for you then?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
No, that match I exemplified greenhornery. The 2017 World Shoot did not necessarily, in my opinion, play to my strengths. It was exceptionally low hit factor and tight shots in a way that were like the top three guys that won. Like you look at all of them, like, yep, that checks out. Like
Hmm.
those are all guys absolutely exceptional in that skill set. And I think in a more balanced match, I would have an easier time closing a better percentage.
Yeah.
And
So
that's
let
not dumping on the match or whatever. That's the reality.
No, it's the reality of like a range and what they set up and all this stuff. I mean, like let's briefly talk about the range that World Shoot would be at, which there was a match there not too long ago, and there have been plenty of matches there, and it's not everything, but some of the hit factors are kind of a tell on what can be set up at that match.
Yeah.
Um, and when you look at a match like that, and at least for production optics, all you average a 10 global factor for that, then that's like, oh, that's interesting. That's not a 7. That's higher than a 7.
Yeah, that's obviously right. That's a match that's going to play to Americans or Filipinos' strengths a lot. And it's probably also going to compress the scores a lot. So, your ability to contend with knowing the score and the fact that it's going to come down to the last stage will be a factor.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Anyway, I like that answer for you. I think that's good. Um, um, all right. So we talked about training and a little bit, but I want to go back there for a good like because there are training sessions that I go out to and I'm just like, okay, I trained today. Like I shot I'm talking about live fire. I went out and shot, and I don't really feel anything about it, any certain way. And then there are other training sessions where I'll go out and shoot, and after I get done, I'm like, wow, that was actually productive, like very productive. Um, what, f- I guess, what creates that for you in the sense that, like, or are they all productive, or do you feel the same way after every training session?
No, definitely not. I think Andreas on a show a while ago said something that is obvious when you say it, but blew my mind when he said it, is that practice sessions are, in terms of their quality in every way, are on a normal distribution. So, like in terms of how you shoot, there's going to be most of the practices you're going to show up and it's going to be normal. The 60% in the middle from 30% up to 70%, like 90% of the time, it's going to be somewhere in there where it's kind of average.
Yep.
And then a very small percentage of the time, it'll be really bad. Really small percentage of the time, it'll be exceptional.
Mm.
And in terms of the shooting performance, I would pretty much agree with that. In terms of the sensation of productivity, I would not. I would say that probably 70% of the time I leave feeling like, wow, I did some hard stuff today. It got a little bit better over the course of the practice, but it was clearly productive and I don't feel that good about my shooting. That's the
Yeah,
impression I leave the practice with.
yeah, and that's the one I'm talking about. That's like that I want more of. I want and what it sets what it feels like it for me is it at least that there's something that I should do, and then I set that up. It's not something I want to do. Like I want to do stuff that's easy that I can already do. Like that's what I if like oh I'll just do that. But it's the ones that I was like I should do that thing, and then I set it up, and I feel a little bit like oh man, this is not going to be like this is going to be difficult, and then I do it, and I like make a little bit of progress, and then anyway what I'm describing is like struggle, like work when I'm training, and then I get done and I'm like yeah that was pretty good, like as in
Yeah,
good as in productive.
right.
um, and and I every single time I find resistance to it because there's that idea of like, well, what should I set up? And then there's like the battle of, should I set that up? But maybe if I add this little piece over here that I want to do, but then it's like, well, no, I mean, is that going to be helpful?
Yeah, see, I kind of find, and I mean, tell me what you think of this. I find myself wanting to practice stuff that I am not ready for, and that's like the fatal flaw for me. Is I'll want to do integration style execution drills where I'm
Mm,
practicing basically a hard stage section where you're putting together movement, every kind of transition, probably not gun handling usually, but like make it a very technically demanding, hard thing with shooting on the move and precision shooting all mixed in there. And then I realized like I want to do that first to sort of cold test. And my inclination will be to do that for like way too long. When it's like, no, you clearly need to break this down and work on the components that you know are weak already. But I'll want to just keep doing that because my inclination is to be like, oh, well, this is hard. It must be productive. But you can spend 600 rounds doing that stuff and realize, oh, well, I probably learned some stuff, but didn't actually improve the skills required to actually do better at it long term.
yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. Like, there's the balance point in it.
Yeah.
Where, yeah, and that's the same thing. Like, I want to set up this massive stage. I want to do this whole thing, and then after I run it one time, I'll be like, oh man, there's so much that I could have done better. And then I'll like change something, and I'll do it again. And at that point, then to have the awareness to stop myself and say, all right, this element right here is what I'm gonna put the rest of this session on. Uh, and it helps a lot. Like you and I are in a similar situation where we can kind of shoot whenever we want. We don't have to like drive. I don't have to drive to a range. So it's like I could work on the other four things that I saw like the rest of the week, and I could work on this one thing right now. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I find that piece to be easier. Where I think probably it's difficult for people is like, well, I get to the range once a week, and it's 45 minutes away from my house. Um,
Yeah, for most people that are in that situation, right? Like working on the skill components. If you're wanting to be, if you have a goal and you want to accomplish it in a year, that's the way to do it. Like working on execution training for most people is not the most important part, unless you're like in a very specific area, right? If you're like high B to mid M, like that's the bracket of people usually they need to go do a bunch of skills integration, but pretty much everyone else needs to improve the skills they have.
Yes. And do you mean, and for you, what is it? What is that like? Because I think a lot of people will be like, oh, Mason, like you've got all, like technically you can do everything. So why wouldn't you just focus on execution training? So what would you say to that?
The answer to that is because the errors don't come up. If I make this procedure simple, I'll never make mistakes. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way. It's just, it gets to a point where, and I'm sure you'd probably agree with this, like you have to make it hard in a very specific way to make mistakes that you can learn from. So
Yes.
like, the very, very simple drills, like you have to hold yourself, if you hold yourself to a very high standard, right, you can find meat on the bone almost no matter what you're working on. But it gets to a point where for me anyway, I feel like doing doubles, for example, is like trying to wring blood out of a stone. It's like doing 10-yard doubles, trying to like shoot faster and hold a smaller group. It's like, how much faster does it need to be than 20 and how much smaller does it need to be than a fist size group? It's
Yeah.
like, I'm better off trying to work on that skill in a different manner that's more complicated or difficult.
Yeah.
And
A-
that's why.
And it's not like you can't make it fall apart by shooting 14 and 15 splits,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like how much like what is this going to give me right here?
Right. And how am I going to implement that in a match actually?
Yeah, because our matches don't consist of standing and shooting doubles and
Nope.
measuring that. Like if they did, then that's what we would all train, and we would train to do that and shoot a fist size group with 15 splits instead of 18 to 20 because there's such a big difference between an 18 and 20 split and a and
Well,
a
yeah, it,
14 split.
there's a huge difference in terms of if I'm here and I want to get here, the difference is massive. But in terms of like on a stage, how much is it actually going to matter? It's probably immeasurably small.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Um yeah, so that's I think that all of this is, I don't know, people have that, so I don't know, I don't want to take, I am curious with your answers because not because I'm like, oh, I'm going to do that thing, but I'm curious because I don't know, my mind processes in a lot of different ways with drawing inspiration from people. Um,
Sure.
and and so I don't know, I want people to hear that in a way of like, this is very specific, and creating scenarios that become very specific to you is super important. It has to be.
Yeah.
Um,
I
and
I think the place a lot of people fall down in terms of directing their training is understanding what it is they're there to accomplish. Like the goal setting piece for most people is criminally underdeveloped. Like
and
almost no matter how much time you're investing or how much, whether no matter resources you're investing, time, money, energy, etc. If you're even like what we call a mid level of commitment, it's appropriate and reasonable to have actually written down well defined goals.
yeah,
And I mean, like, that's I don't know how specific you get with that. I have it's like formulaic for me when I take on a client and I want them to try to like understand why they're doing it.
yeah. I mean, I that is something that I had right when I started, and then there was a middle section where I didn't have that specific, and now I've gotten very specific with it, with on like what am I, and I'm talking like big picture goal, like what am I trying to do, and then that becomes so much easier to identify these places that I need to train.
So
Um,
follow up question, right? Like if I take your most recent practice session, is there like a genealogy map, like a family tree map that shows you exactly how you got to your big picture goal
oh,
in terms
from
of content of the training session?
oh, based off of the training session, like I guess I'm not understanding it fully.
So if I take like, okay, I did this training session, I worked on 3 drills, these skills. Like, is there a clear line that gets you from here back to the original goal?
There is now, yeah,
Yeah,
there
that's
is now.
important. Right?
I even think at times, last year and the year before, it was I don't think I could have answered that. I was like, well, I just did this thing because I thought maybe I should do it. Um, and now it's way more like, what am I trying to actually do? Well, I'm trying to win matches. So
Yeah.
to do that, I have to focus on, these skills. I have stuff written everywhere. Um,
Yes.
and and if I'm not working on those skills, there's got to be a good reason for it. Like,
Yep.
and there's no way around it.
Right. Yeah. Yes. 100%.
And that's been huge. It's a very clear direction at this point.
And I think for most people, that 99% of people that are listening to this, like that, you're probably not going to be able to have the wisdom you need to be able to like answer that question that specifically. If you're unless you're someone that's already a very accomplished or seasoned masterclass or GM class shooter, you probably don't fully understand the skills you're trying to get in such a manner that you could articulate it and draw a clear line from this practice session all the way back to my big picture goal. But you should definitely start with a big picture goal. Like the way I structure the goals when I take on clients or when I every year before the season, I'd be like, hey, big picture goal. That's basically a motivational statement. I want to win an IPSC World Shoot, right? And then there'll be 4 subcomponents to that. That'll be anything from like raw skill areas that I want to develop all the way down to behavioral habits. Like I want to behave this way in matches. I want to work out, eat right, yada, yada, whatever, right? And I'll break those 4 big picture things down to time frames usually. They're like, I'm going to do a focused training block where I'm accomplishing these, supporting these goals in this way, and there's a clear line. And if I take any practice session I do, and I'm not like doing this like a formula, like, oh, I'm going to take a column from here and a column from here and boil it down and create a training a session. But if I look at any session I do, right, I can draw a line in reverse and see exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing because I have very clearly defined goals that support the big picture goals I have.
Yeah. Yes. And I think, well, I mean, I mean, what has happened for me is that I have been beat very specifically at certain matches in a way that has made me think that there were times where I shortcut a process that if I didn't shortcut that, then there could have been a different result. And so then that has in turn motivated me to be more intentional about it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of them. I mean, the other one is just, asking myself the question of like, why am I doing this? Well, I'm certainly not doing this to just continue doing what I'm doing. I'm doing this so I can learn and improve. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I don't know. It's very exciting, but it's like, whenever I'm training, it adds a ton of focus to it. So it's like, I better be doing things productive. when I'm training.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, is that similar to you? Is it from maybe losses, or is it from what has made you focus on certain goals? I mean, it seems like you have done this, you've been doing this for longer than I have, obviously, but you've been formulating goals for a little while now.
Yeah, I think I think the only thing that's changed over time is the way that I process the data, right? So
Right.
like early on, it would probably be like, "Hey, I lost this match in this way, so I'm gonna fix this problem. Hey, you botched a reload or whatever, and that like on this in this specific stage that lost you the match,
Yeah.
and so I will fix that problem immediately." And over time, it's more like I think a little bit. I'd like to think a little bit more of a sophisticated approach to be like, no, like you had issues, you had a couple penalties, you had a couple drop reloads or whatever, but like those things affect your time in a very specific way, and no matter how good you get, you're going to make mistakes in matches. So rather than looking at the mistakes, how do we look at the unrealized time, the unrealized score gains that are subtle and understated, the ways that you're losing to people that you would never, that no other person would ever look at your score and specifically be like, oh well, yeah, you dropped two reloads, or oh, you double Charlie this many targets.
Right.
So like example for that for me right now, right, is like I think we talked about this a little bit. I'm have this old habit of wanting to be a perfectionist and avoid mistakes and shoot perfect points all the time, and that strategy, I'm trying to understand further how that strategy is relevant and when it's not. So in situations that have low factor stages or lots of risky sections, right, that mentality and that discipline to be able to stop the sight and shoot perfect points all the time, that's very important.
Works
But on
super well.
medium high factor stages, you have to again have the discipline, if you want to think about it that way, to say it's a risk to play this safe. I can't do that, right? So cultivating the associated skills with trying to be faster is sort of the big picture goal for me right now. If I pulled up the sheets of like my goal sheets from the last 4 years, some version of it would say you got beat by Jake because he shot 20 more targets on the move than you, right? It'd be some version of that for like the last 4 years. So I'm still just trying to like figure out more sophisticated ways to work on that and implement that stuff.
Yes. Yeah. And so you're not, I think, I don't know, when I first started out, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I want a fixed thing to do to then get me to be better.
Mm-hmm.
That runs out at some point.
Of course.
And obviously, and a lot of people stop, they quit at that point, which is totally fine. And then at a point beyond that, you have to continually change how it works. And yeah, so this has been, I mean, it's been huge for myself, at least in developing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't know, we play in such a, this game is so interesting, and I think that's why continue to do it. Like this the score itself is such an interesting way to play, uh, because it has so much conflict in the mind, and so I I like the way you've described it on like here are some rules that then can make me behave in a certain way, that like here's how I should behave decided by this rule. And so
Right. It's difficult because if you like on a super squad context, like I remember like the first couple of years I was on one, right? Like I tried to just like be there and treat other shooters as entertainment and not like they're a model for what I should be doing. Be like, yeah, you sort of like watch other people and check store put their strengths in the back of your head and be like, how can I learn from that later? But then there's a period in the middle where I'm like, oh no, I'm competing with these people. I have to try to like mimic their style and copy them and be better than them.
yeah.
And it's that doesn't work. Like in order to have the conviction to follow the wisdom you've gained in training, you have to make it very simple, right? Like a perfect example of that is attack and control, like JJ's classic model. Like that is insanely underdeveloped in terms of an actual strategy that you could explain to someone else,
Yeah.
right? Like you couldn't explain like what attack and control means to one person would mean something completely different to other people in terms of the rules that they put, the specific rules in terms of their attitude towards it. But you have to make it that simple to yourself in order to follow the rules under pressure.
Yeah.
And so like there's lots of styles that sort of clash and accomplish roughly the same result, but in order to do it yourself, you got to learn a lot about yourself and then dumb it down a lot.
Yeah, yeah, making it so simple.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, it's interesting. Um, eh, I'm going to, there's a lot more that we could talk for a lot longer, but we're at like an hour, and I want to go to bed. So uh, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff on. Well, maybe we'll dip into it a little bit here on that super squad kind of realm, and kind of navigating that, uh, and navigating that in a productive way. And for you, you've been on super squads for years now. Since what you were 2017 was your first, or 2016?
2017.
2017, so a while. And then it's like every single year you're on one or multiple from then. And so let's say you see someone who you're competing against make a mistake, and it's like it's a pretty big one. um Maybe whatever it is, maybe they have to do a standing reload, they drop a mag on the ground, or they double mic a target, or something that's just like, oh wow. And you're up after them, you see that, and then you go and you're going to shoot the stage. What's your like default approach to that if you see that?
Zooming out, it's like I try to not think about the math in terms of me versus the shooter. I
Okay.
try to think about me versus the stage. And so, what I'm able to accomplish by flexing my skills and experience is dictated during the walkthroughs. It's really not dictated by what other people do.
Okay.
And there's the only caveat to that would be I I think I'm able to think on my feet during stages a bit more than some other people, probably mostly as a function of experience. I've been competing a pretty long time, but I am decently good about realizing when I'm playing things too safe and starting to like gas it on some sections, or making small mistakes and having the wisdom to like just play it safe through technically demanding stuff and then get on the gas when I'm able to and sort of cover up mistakes that way. I think maybe a little bit more than some other shooters, but I
Yeah.
I you just see the gravy dripping off of someone else's mistakes and want to go catch it in your mouth. Like that's usually just serves to harm your ability to do what you already know how to do.
Okay. Have you gone in and slurped up some of that gravy at different times?
I've tried to.
Intentionally tried to, and has it worked out sometimes?
Um, I don't think so.
Okay.
I can't think of a single actual instance where I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to capitalize on someone else's mistake, and it actually made a meaningful difference.
Mm,
Like, obviously, been times when I'm like, oh wow, like that just opened the door. If I just do what I'm already talking about doing, I'm going to pick up 30 points, and that happened. That's happened dozens of times, of course.
sure. Sure.
But it's not really like a major part of my thought process. Like, how does this guy's mistake affect what I'm about to do?
All right. Yeah. And by answering that question, I'm assuming it's the same response as when you see someone really cook a stage where they're like, "Dang, that is a 10% stage win. Like nobody's going to touch that."
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
or maybe it's not like that in the sense of nobody's going to touch that, but it's just like, okay, that was really good. I'm still going to just do what I was going to do.
yeah.
Um,
I think might be more inclined to take the bait in that situation,
okay. So
but probably not. It.
So does that then depend on the position of the like time frame of the match? So you're getting down to the end of the match, and someone does that, and
Yeah, like I mean, you're at some point you're a fool not to, right? Like if you know you're neck and neck with someone into like three or less stages, you can't play it defensive the entire time if they're on fire.
no,
And I mean, like, sometimes like I look at like this most recent production nationals, like JJ had a pretty phenomenal match. I mean, I don't know how many match stages the match was, but he shot something close to perfect until the final stage when he had won by so much he could have basically not shot the stage and won.
yeah,
He could have walked to the positions and double dealt at every target and won.
yeah,
uh, so like in a situation like that, there's nothing you can do. But if you know you're neck and neck with someone and it's do or die, there's been a dozen times that I'm like, all right, like time to throw all the pasta at the wall and see which ones stick. Like I
yeah,
think of a situation at a limited nationals, I think when it was ended on two like classifier style freestyle weekend stages,
yeah,
and I cut the raw time by like 4 seconds. Like, well, this is mathematically possible to win if I can connect with these hits.
if
And
yeah.
to be like third is the same as fifth, so I might as well ship it.
I'm thinking about, and I don't know if you've experienced this before. This is in hindsight, so it's not, at least for me, it's not perfect. Um, but getting down to the end of a match, and you know who you're competing against, and you know who's close, and things are neck and neck. Uh, I mean, for me this scenario unfolded, and I don't think obviously wouldn't have helped me because I still had to do what I needed to do. But understanding behavior from the people, or in this case it was multiple people, but the person leading up to that final stage or those final stages, on if they are on fire or if they're like just hanging on, um and how that, I mean, it still wouldn't affect it. I'm just blabbing at this point, but it wouldn't affect how I shot. But I suppose it,
Do you mean in terms of like seeing someone doing very well and just kind of having an impression on them if they're about to mess it up or not?
yeah, like, oh, okay, they connected a couple of good stages like really well. Like, are they gonna do that? And then when are they gonna fall off?
Yeah,
And playing that in the strategy. And
hard
so, wait, what was that? I missed that part.
very hard to predict that sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, especially like, I mean, this is another one. If I'm up first and they shoot after me anyway, so it's just like, what's gonna happen? Um,
Yeah,
I, it's like, well, I guess I just should have been better more of the time.
yeah, yeah. If you look at what is this actual match performance relative to my potential, usually all those questions become a lot less relevant. And if you ask what is my potential if I actually change my training over the last 6 to 8 months, it's basically completely irrelevant.
Yeah, yeah, because there's so much that can be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you're always looking down the barrel of like if I look in the rear view from a year ago, you're looking at always a couple per whole percent of unrealized gains if you knew that then what you knew now, right? So
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I don't know. It's fascinating, all of it. Anyway, we'll wrap it up. I'll wrap it up, and we'll get back to training, but sleep first. Uh, Thank you, Mason.
no problem, buddy. This is fun.
Yeah, appreciate the time. People always like listening to things while they drive, and it's not a 20-minute podcast like we did last time. All right, everybody, that's it.